Okay, we'll get underway. So you've heard various references to the Cephia data management platform this morning as Anthony was walking through the different components of the program. What I wanted to accomplish really was a couple things. I have a number of slides that'll walk us through those key milestone or phases within the program. Anthony was talking about establishing the baseline, submitting a project, the project scenario development process, and then subsequently the installation and commissioning in M&V. In short, the way you can think of the Cephia data management platform, or I'll refer to it as CDMP here forward, is a web-based or a cloud-based software platform that has been designed to be consistent with the CPACE program guidelines that you've heard Anthony articulate this morning, and bring a project through its initial development phases, whether that's in a preliminary assessment or what Anthony had referred to as the walkthrough assessment, all the way through a level 2 or an investment grade audit, or if you're on a renewable PV type of project, more commonly referred to as a feasibility study. So I want to kind of give you a brief orientation on how that works, again, emphasize the data that we're looking for, also how our team at SRS is available through our account management team, which you've been introduced to Brian Bursteiner, who runs that group for us. And I know some of you in the room here have had some working relationship with that SRS account management team to date. But in any case, there is both a tool, if you will, available for your support and an account management team to help guide through this process. The key point is we're looking to get projects through the system efficiently, but as Anthony mentioned earlier, it's important that we do it in a technically sound and a transparent manner so that we can get the buy-in of the third-party capital providers, not to mention your owner prospect, to buy into these types of projects. And then after I go through the slide deck, I have examples in the book, what we refer to as project scenario reports. And one of the things I'm going to point to here is one of the powers of this platform is the ability to relatively quickly produce different project scenarios, ultimately aiming at what is the optimized scenario that we can develop to get an owner on board and get a capital provider on board. And so I want to actually walk through a couple samples. I have a sample that will kind of benchmark if an owner was to go down to their, I think Anthony mentioned, their existing lender relationship, and so that lender would offer a commercial loan. Those terms may be something like 20% down for a 5 to 6 year term, maybe at 5-6%, something like that. I want to actually go through that and say, this is what the option of the building owner would be today if they wanted to leverage third-party financing. And then we prepared a project sample that actually is modeled after a real project in CPACE that leverages 20-year PACE financing, and see how the numbers look there. So we'll have a couple real-world examples. And then I also have a solar PV only project, or what was referred to this morning as more of a targeted, single ECM, which would go via the fast track that Anthony described. So that's what I'd like to accomplish as an agenda. Much like Anthony encouraged, if you have questions along the way, we can just deal with them as they come up, and we'll go from there. So let me just set the stage, thinking of what are the key milestone or life cycle steps along the way with CPACE. You've heard a little bit of this, but I wanted to kind of think of it in sequence now, right? Is you have an initial application that you submit, and Will and the team at Cephia are going to take that initial application, which is going to include some property financials, and in short, they're going to pre-qualify that building. And Genevieve's going to give a little bit more flavor around that, but I just wanted to make the point, at that early stage, part of that pre-qualification is going to be a general ballpark number of what size project a PACE assessment will likely support for your project. So that is an important, key data element, because as you're working your project scenarios, you're obviously going to have to be mindful of that. Then we, after the initial application is approved by Will's team, we move into the project scenario development mode, and that's generally when you will get a handoff from the Cephia team to the SRS team. We'll open up a username and password for you in the CDMP, and we'll begin to collect some data from you, and I'm going to walk through what that data looks like. In short, again, what we're looking to do there is take the data that you have developed, proposed ECMs, what the related projected cost and savings estimates that you've put together, and so forth, and begin to put them into the system and evaluate that project from the point of view of a building owner or a third-party financier, and this notion of having a savings to investment ratio that's greater than 1, taking a look at how are the projected cash flows going to perform over that term, things like this particular project based on the weighted average of those ECMs, right? How long of a term would your project qualify, and things of that nature. Once we get to a point where there's consensus around those stakeholder groups, and I'm going to speak in a moment, a little bit more about the different stakeholder groups, but once the stakeholders are comfortable, meaning the owner is bought into the project, you, as I'm going to assume we're predominantly the project development role here, once you're comfortable that the project is optimized in your mind, it's meeting the building owner's needs, it's meeting the financial criteria of the program and so forth, at that point we'll submit the project for technical review. And Anthony's kind of given you a briefing on what that process is going to look like. In short, we're then going to provide Anthony, and then you'll hear from Tom Coughlin after me this afternoon. We will then get underway with the technical review process. Technical review team will get access to your project in the CDMP, and then they'll be looking at the data in short, and Tom will give you more details on what that's about, but just to think of it on a summary basis, the technical review team is trying to put a reasonableness test around the projected cost of the project and the projected savings, and looking at your supporting documentation that justifies those savings projections and getting comfortable that it was done in a technically sound and transparent manner. Once it's approved in the technical review process, it's then submitted back to Cephia, who will complete the full financial underwriting. And at that juncture, Cephia is going to collect all the building owner and property financial information, tax returns and the like, and put it through its final financial underwriting, get the commitment for the owner, prepare the financing agreement, and go to closing. And again, Genevieve's going to give a little bit more flavor around that in her remarks this afternoon. At that point, the project will be scheduled for installation and commissioning. Tom will speak to some of the commissioning checklist items that we'll be looking for. They also will be appended to your project file in the CDMP, so all the stakeholders have availability to that. And then the concept is at that finance closing, on the basis of how complex the project is, number of ECMs, interactive effects of those ECMs, the stakeholders will agree to an M&V plan, a measurement and verification plan. And usually the variables around that are, what is the perception of the risk of underperformance, and therefore what will the owner and the capital provider like to see in terms of the length or the term of the measurement and verification period, and also at what frequency would they like to see some reporting on the, how are we doing, actual performance versus the projections where we all left off to agree to the, to the financing. And once that plan is in place, that will be uploaded after construction, and I'll speak to that in a little bit more detail. We'll begin to get performance data and then measure actual versus projections. So let me talk about the stakeholders. Anthony set this conversation up a little bit with some of his comments this morning, but I like this chart to emphasize the point. What's different here, most likely if you're on the project development side, is you see a few more actors appear on this screen, right? You see this notion of third-party lenders. There's an emerging third-party insurance industry here that is seeking to insure these kinds of projects. So you may have that stakeholder at the table. Depending on the size of the building, you may not only have the building owner, but you may have professional property management at the table. Of course, you have Cephia as the program administrator, which for all intents and purposes is a capital provider or a lender. So you have a capital provider or a lender funding the project. And as was discussed this morning, you also have, in most cases, an existing mortgage on the property, and the nature, again, of the PACE assessment process is the existing mortgage holder must give consent to the PACE assessment, right? So those folks on the top side of that chart, they tend to come at this from a financial orientation, right? In short, they're typically finance professionals, investment professionals. So as Anthony was saying, they talk the language of finance. The folks on the bottom, which largely makes up this room, right, the contracting community, the auditing community, engineering community, or consultant community, they generally speak the technical language, and often there's a gulf in between. So part of what we've learned and have been solving for over the past 3 years or so is how do you take that technical project data that you folks are all expert at, and how, in the context of bringing in third-party financiers to the equation, how do you translate that technical data so that you're speaking the same language with the finance community, and you put the owner and the capital providers and also the existing mortgage holder that has to say yes, right? How do you get them all on the same page, speaking the same language, right, with aligned interest, that they can all see from their vantage point, this is a value-add project, right? So case in point, just think about the existing mortgage holder for a moment. The existing mortgage holders, I think as Anthony was referring to earlier, in the early days of PACE, let's say 2008, 2009, when this concept initially emerged, there was an initial kickback from the lending industry, say, oh, well, why would we do that, right? Why would we say yes to a lien that would trump our position? And that, of course, was a natural first response. But as you begin to look at how these projects are developed, generally speaking, that existing mortgage holder is going to be most focused on two primary items. One is, how does this particular project affect the repayment ability of my borrower? And secondly, how does this particular project affect my collateral, right? So in the event that my borrower goes south for whatever reason, that, you know, their business hits troubled times, is my borrower in better position to repay my original loan as the existing lender? And in the event that I would have to foreclose, what does the project do there? And if you think about PACE, and again, when we get to these scenario reports and look at actual projects and the way the cash flows and the impact to the asset value, you'll generally arrive at a where's the problem position, right? So in this case, if you produce a project that has cash flow positive benefits to the owner, they're certainly in better repayment ability position, and the asset has certainly been enhanced, right? So from that point of view, this is the way that you have to present a project, right, as opposed to this piece of equipment, it costs this much, it's going to last this long. These are the nuances, right, in terms of when I use that phrase there of speaking different languages, that's what I'm referring to. Make sense? Okay, so just to set the stage a little further, you may be thinking, what's really the benefit to me as a contractor or consultant or project developer? We want to take that concept that I just described and help support your project proposal process. In other words, can you more effectively present that building owner prospect with an optimized project that better speaks to their needs and their language, and get a higher conversion rate from proposal to project commitment? Of course, the number one thing that we generally hear frustration in the contractor community is such a low conversion rate from proposal to paying project. And we can certainly add some value there. That generally is brought to the table by, when you'll see the reporting in a moment, all the financial metrics that we've been describing this morning. The good news is you don't have to be an expert on those. Much of that is turnkeyed after putting a certain amount of information into the system. And our general experience, and I like to use this term, well-designed projects, generally what we see in the PACE community and leveraging what Anthony was referring to in his remarks as the power of pace, projects that can get 15 to 20-year financing, that is a phenomenal power to produce these kinds of projects that, generally speaking, will meet this definition. They'll require no out-of-pocket investment from the building owner, and the majority of them will generate immediate positive cash flow. And that's a pretty compelling offer, right? Or that's the so-called too good to be true offer, which frankly is exactly where you want the conversation to go on the building owner, right? You want the building owner to respond, well, that'd be great, I think as Anthony described, if I could only believe you that those savings would materialize. My point was you want that conversation to arrive at the point where the building owner thinks, wow, that's even a too good to be true offer, right? If I could meet those bullets, of course. And the point is then you can rely on the CPACE program structure and specifically the technical review process where built into this program, right, is the added value of having third-party technical review. And that's quite powerful. In our learning, when we've done some exit interviews with the owners that you see on, referenced on some of these placards around the room, is the number one feedback we hear from the owners is they say, you know what, I really, as I learned about this program and about the process, I really felt I can trust the fact that the energy savings are going to be there. You'll see in the reporting in a moment, we'll even help them conduct what typically the financier is trained to do, which is, conduct some sort of a worst case analysis if things don't go as planned in the real world. Of course, we all know that happens. But anyway, it brings a level of comfort to that owner that they can trust the program, they can trust the projected savings, and that's been very helpful to get to the next step in the process. And of course, the fact that we have all this data collected in a standardized way that the technical review team is very comfortable, here's where they need to look, here are the things that they're looking for, it's been able to steadily accelerate the technical review process. So then I wanted to emphasize, you're not in it alone. Again, we recognize this is for most of you, this may be a different way of preparing a project, let's say. That's not lost on us. We have not only built a software platform that will help facilitate the data in and the analytics, but we also have a team that is available to support you through the process. And that, again, is going to relate to your proposal development process, if you would like to engage us on that, throughout the entire project scenario development, and ultimately, the general message is how you develop a project is not likely to change, right? You're still going to get through your energy savings calculations, whether that be a spreadsheet methodology that you're currently using, or whether it be in the case that Anthony was describing this morning on the whole building modeling, right? If you're doing a multi-ECM type project, you may use third-party modeling tools such as eQuest or Train's Trace program. No different. You'll still, use those programs as you normally would. If you're in the solar PV world, you may use a program such as PV Watts. These are all things that we see on a regular basis. It's simply that the outputs of using those tools, namely the projected savings estimates, are going to become inputs into the CDMP, and that backup or supporting data that's supporting your calculations needs to be appended so that when Tom or Anthony, as part of the technical review team, are reviewing those estimates, they can get comfortable, right, that they meet, technical rigor. Also, some of you may not be familiar with a formal commissioning process or a formal measurement and verification process. Again, we've built some general templates or modules to help support this. And generally speaking, it's relatively straightforward, but we are going to want to see that there is a commissioning checklist or plan in place to ensure, again, put yourself in the shoes of the third-party capital provider, right? They have to ensure, are we getting installed what we agreed in the finance agreement to get installed? If there are change orders in that process from financing approval to actually executing the installation, that's okay. It's just that they have to be documented, and those numbers may move around a little bit. But again, all of that has to be transparent. We have ways of doing that. Relative to the M&V, again, the general logic there is the M&V term and frequency of reporting will likely change on a project-by-project basis on the logic of, what are the complications of this particular project, what's the risk of underperformance that the stakeholders view, and a term and a frequency will be agreed to. And then it is also an opportunity from the consultant or the contractor's point of view. If you recall, one of Anthony's comments this morning was that M&V and an O&M contract fee for up to 5 years can also be included in the financing, assuming that, again, the SIR works on an overall basis. But it is an opportunity for you to stay on board after the closing of an installation of your project so that you can measure and verify the performance. And I would just like to emphasize, although you see a bunch of placards around the room on early success stories in the first year, it is important to recognize, first of all, you have all bias aside, a wonderful opportunity here in Connecticut. Connecticut is leading the country in this CPACE program to date, right? And it's an opportunity for us as a collective community here in the state of Connecticut to drive that forward, of course. But it's critically important that this first generation of PACE projects performs in the marketplace, right? Or we could all be going home sometime soon, right? So again, we've talked about the level of skepticism that owners typically bring to the table. The worst thing we want to do is, launch the program, mount a bunch of first generation projects, let's call them, and have them underperform, and have the ownership community come back to us and say, I told you so, right? So these are the things that I know that's a little bigger picture, but it's important for us as a community to drive this concept to the next level. Will, you want to go to the next slide? Right. Question? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes?
Quick question. If a project was gone through the utility, CLP or UI, would it have to go through both utility as well as CPACE?
It's a good question. The question is if there's some M&V requirement for UI or CL&P utility.
It's usually post-inspection, make sure what you said is going to be in the measure.
Yep. Yeah, generally I would view that more as of the commissioning process, right, as opposed to M&V. And in some case, we're kind of early on in this commissioning in M&V now, as these first, generation of projects are now getting through that phase. But we are trying to coordinate with the utility parties in that matter. On commissioning, on M&V, I would say probably not, because as Anthony was describing, the M&V of the utility program, are we back in business? Okay. The M&V methodology of the utility program, again, is usually measuring the performance above code. Follow the logic that Anthony was referring to earlier, as opposed to the actual baseline, whether that baseline was whole building or it could have been an isolated measure, right? Or it could have been one of those scenarios Anthony was describing, right, on a vacant building, whatever. I guess to summarize the point, what you're M&Ving against, if you will, in the utility program is often different than the baseline that you would be using to take advantage of CPACE financing.
Would the equipment needed to do the M&V for 5 years be included in cost?
Yes, it can be, yeah. Again, with the caveat, you still have to make the SIR, right? So everything's in play as long as the SIR works, right? If not, that may have to be a cost out of bounds, or the owner could maybe dial back the M&V period, right? There's some variables around that in the conversation and closing with the building owner, you'll come to a agreement, a meeting of the minds of the stakeholders. Sorry, was there another question?
Does CPACE impose any penalty if your M&V shows you didn't hit the savings you'd like a performance-based incentive program.
Right. So the question was, do I get a demerit if I don't meet if I don't meet actual versus projected? And the answer is no. So I mean, all the stakeholders have to go into this with their eyes wide open. Now, we have had a few projects where an ESCO has brought a project to the table and actually has guaranteed the savings. That's a different matter. That is available if the owner would like. Of course, that comes with some level of added cost, right? So again, as Genevieve was describing this morning, this is an open market program. There's no limitation for the contractor or consultant. They can bring a guaranteed savings project to the table. If you recall my stakeholder chart, there was energy insurer. The energy insurance industry is beginning to pipe up now and are looking at, being an active stakeholder in this game and saying, well, we'll add a premium fee to insure those savings. So these are all optional components, but there's no hard and fast rule that there must be a guarantee. And in the M&V period, there isn't any, just to be clear, there isn't any guarantee, what happens if we have a shortfall. Now, I would suggest that's the opportunity of the consulting and the contracting industry to engage with the building owner. And again, as long as the SIR works, you can include the fees for that post-installation M&V, right, for up to 5 years, right, and to stay on with the project. So we're seeing that in, frankly, some of the bigger projects. As you've looked around the room here, you've probably seen a number of projects of $1 million to $2 million in value, that type of thing that have multi-ECMs. It's not uncommon to see the consultant include an M&V agreement for up to 5 years as a component of that, and included in the financing. And general experience is, I'll go back to my so-called well-designed project. Generally speaking, we see a well-designed project is able to accommodate those 5-year M&V fees without really, degrading the quality of the project in the eyes of the capital provider and the owner. Make sense? Okay. Okay. So now I want to. We've got a few screenshots of you may be wondering the kind of how it works question, right? So Anthony gave us a pretty good overview this morning of the importance of the baseline data, right? And I won't get into repeating a lot of that, other than to say, if you recall, the baseline can be a number of things, right? It can be a modeled baseline, it can be a whole building baseline, or it can be simply a targeted measure baseline, depending on the kind of project that you're doing. So the general message there is there's flexibility, but a key starting point is to upload baseline data. Generally speaking, we're getting that from the utility bill data, although again, with the caveat in the modeling world, it may be through another methodology. Recall, and even in the solar PV projects, oftentimes, in that type of a project, the solar contractor is only really caring about the electric data. Good news is, I think most of you probably know, in Connecticut, both our electric utilities are participants in the Green Button Initiative, which means we can generally go get the utility bill data in electronic form, right, in an Excel compatible form. Inside the CDMP, there is a module where you simply take that electronic utility bill data, and as long as we're mindful of this convention of start date, end date, consumption, and cost, it will automatically upload that baseline data into the system. And as Anthony was describing, some of the ASTM, BEPA standard methodologies, things like normalizing for the calendar month, right? As you all likely well know, the utility bills don't come neatly, from the first of the month to the last of the month, and we want to normalize that to calendar month to do some of our trending analysis and projections and so forth. And the system will automatically take those calculations into account. So you don't have to be an expert on the ASTM standard. Every line item in the, whatever it is, a 20-page standard, you can have the comfort that this technically meets that goal, but our objective here today was just to make you aware of the processes that are happening behind the scenes so that we can all get comfortable that we have a technically sound baseline to start. Obviously, that's the foundation that the project is going to be built on from there, and critical first step. our account management team. Our general experience is, the first couple times you go through this, frankly, we're going to be there to handhold you, and in many cases do this on your behalf, with the goal to get you comfortable enough that obviously we want you to have a whole portfolio of these projects by the time we meet this time next year. But we're realists like any new software program. You're not going to know it like a champ on the first round through, and we understand that. The next thing I mentioned about so now we're into the project scenario development phase. I guess my key thing I would want to reiterate here is you won't do a lot different, right, in your current methodology to prepare ECM recommendations than you do now. Ultimately, a point we want to get to is we have, much like the upload tool for the utility bill data, there's an upload tool for the ECM data, right? So things like this is a screenshot of it, the name of the ECM, a brief description, what's your estimated implementation cost, what's your estimated annual savings, and then the impact to the electric and the fuels, and if you have a water conservation impact, et cetera. So there's a number of those other fields. You do what you do internally to develop those projections. You take the upload template, import that similar to the way we just did the utility bill, and then if you go to the next slide, Will, that then populates inside this project scenario development module the ECM data, right? Things like the implementation cost. One of the questions this morning was about the utility programs, right? So generally speaking, very high number of the ECMs will have a utility incentive. At that point in time, you likely won't have what the utilities refer to as the LOA, right? The letter of agreement, but you'll generally have some ballpark estimates, either based on your experience or maybe you're collaborating with the utilities at this point in time in the project development process. So this may be draft numbers, of course, and it depends on what stage you're in the project, but we want to get those in there because of this concept we talked earlier about, buying down the cost of the project at the measure level, and you'll see in the reporting in a few minutes, we're going to want to have those utility incentives itemized on a measure level. Those of you in the solar business, one of the early adopters that's been real successful with PACE, of course, is the solar project developers that have the ZREC. You're familiar with the renewable energy credit system here in Connecticut. If so think about the solar projects, if you combine, and that's generally in the form of an annual incentive over a 15-year term, right? So you have some level of renewable energy credit over a 15-year term, and then you combine that with the 20-year CPACE financing, because of course the solar PV system will be rated 20-25-year life, so you'll generally will qualify for the 20-year term. The short of it is that's usually a home run project, right? So that has really worked well. In any case, we'll talk about this a little bit more detail when we look at the reporting, but each ECM, will recall Anthony's comments, will have an effective useful life rating, right? And then at the ECM level, we are going to assume that those annual savings that you have arrived at will persist over the term of the effective useful life of that measure. And that's a key point. And we will assume those savings disappear after the EUL term has expired, right? Even though we could all argue, right, whether they really disappear in the real world. But the point is, for purposes of doing the financial analytics and the financial underwriting, that's going to be the point of view of the capital provider, right? And we're going to get to that concept of calculating the weighted effective useful life, the average on a savings basis and a cost basis, because recall, that weighted average EUL is going to dictate what is the term of the loan that this project can qualify for, right? I think we talked the logic of that this morning, right? As a lender, you don't want to lend on a project, right, where you have equipment replacement costs that have to come into play, right, in a significant way that would upend your financial return metrics, right? So you want to calibrate the term length in a way that's suitable to the weighted useful life of the various measures. Okay, this will be tough to see, I recognize, but I just want to make a point. We have a report that we'll look at in front of you here in a few moments. But in short, you're going to bring in, when you import those ECMs, you'll have an effective useful life rating. For each ECM, we're going to subscribe to the theory of disaggregated pricing and disaggregated energy savings projections. So each ECM will have an estimated install cost. Again, at the measure level, if there's a utility incentive implied, we want to be transparent on that. What the net cost of each ECM is, its annual savings projection, and then we're going to calculate the life cycle savings over the effective useful life of that particular measure. And from the point of view of the capital provider, we're also going to provide a calculation on the life cycle savings over the finance term, because recall they could be different, right? You could be putting in, let's take the solar PV system, right? It might be a 25-year rated EUL, but the maximum loan term of the CPACE loan is only 20 years, right? So from the point of view of the capital provider is only going to look at those savings over their term, even though the owner, frankly, can assume they're going to enjoy savings beyond the finance term, but for purposes of the finance calculations, we're going to limit those savings over the finance term. Yes, sir?
The ZREC payback per year, where do you put that in on this?
Yeah, the question was if you have a ZREC, or what I refer to as the annual, think of that as an annual recurring incentive as opposed to the traditional utility incentive, Mike, that you were referring to, which is typically treated as a one-time upfront. We have this notion of a ECM-related cost and savings. And you'll see here, we'll drill down on an example of this I have in the scenario reporting, is an annual savings and incentive. So we'll put a value in there, and then we're going to put a term on there for the REC. Typically the RECs are 15 years. And that'll be treated, and we want to treat it that way. That's an important question, because when we look at the cash flows in a moment, which frankly, this is all about, cash flow analysis, that's an important matter because we want that annual cash flow impact to be feathered in right over that 15-year term. Make sense? Okay, down here at the bottom was my point. We're going to use that weighted EUL to set the finance term. We're going to calculate for you quickly, and I'll drill into this a bit more in a moment, this notion of the unleveraged savings to investment ratio, i.e. the self-financed, right? So one of the things as a building owner that I'm going to look at, frankly, even though you're approaching me, right, as a, most likely as a finance potential, I'm still going to want to do the analysis myself, right, which is going to say, well, what if I just fund this out of capital budget? How do those returns look versus if I take advantage of this newfangled CPACE long-term financing, right, and I want to benchmark those two investments against each other, right? So our learning has been, your owner is going to do that, whether you like it or not, or want them to or not. It really is just going to be a matter of course. So you might as well lay out the financial analytics with them and have the ability to have that conversation with them. And again, in a moment when we look at the reporting, I've even done a scenario which the other thought in the building owner's mind is, okay, well, what if I go to my friendly banker that I've been working with for 15 years? I wonder what they would offer me as it relates to terms. And our general experience is you welcome those conversations because, again, that too good to be true characteristic offer of PACE, it really is going to pop up off the page and say, wow, that really does seem like it's too good to be true. So now I'm back to the point where I mentioned earlier, you want the conversation to go is, can I really believe you? If I could believe you, I'd probably do this, right? And then again, you have the strength of the program behind you, the technical review. You have Cephia then in a position to aid in the existing mortgage holder conversation to get the lender consent. And the team aspect of this really, has proved to work quite effectively. I mentioned this notion of including your supporting documentation to support the savings projections and cost projections. I know Tom is going to have a few remarks about this as well. I just wanted to get your wheels turning again. Generally, we don't see this with the contractors or engineering firms, ESCOs we're working with, as much different than their current process, other than to say we have an appendices module, which you can see has a bunch of these subfolders, things like the utility bills, ECM data sheets, if you've done any data logging, if you've engaged with, Mike, to your questions about the utilities, right? Let's say you're in the small B program or something, right? You may want to include information about that incentive. Frankly, to get to finance closing under the incentives bucket, you're going to need to have the signed LOA, right? Because in most cases, that's going to have a significant impact on the financials, right? You're going to buy that project down, whatever it is, let's say on an average 15, 20% or something, right? So that's a material term in the financing and something that in the technical review process we're going to want to see has actually been executed and uploaded, right? And again, any of your modeling data, whether it be spreadsheet calculational data, again, it's all fine as long as it's technically supportable, and Tom will speak to how the technical review process works on that. But just wanted to mention we have an approach to this, right? You can have various documents attached there, but we're going to want to see those to get into technical review. I also wanted to speak to some of the key assumptions before we dug in on the report reviews, because these are important to understand how they're flowing through the calculations. Anthony had mentioned earlier this notion about the uncertainty of the savings estimates, right, both on the cost and consumption side. So you'll see here this plus or minus 10% for each. There's a key assumption input for uncertainty level of the cost estimates, and likewise uncertainty cost of the savings estimates. The general logic here is this: if you're at a level 1 kind of walkthrough analysis, generally we're going to see those numbers be plus or minus 20 to 25%. Right? So think of the context of that. That might be where this tool would be helpful for you in the early proposal phase, right? When you kind of have enough information to define what's the it of this project, right? But frankly, you don't have enough data, or either you haven't got access to enough data, or maybe it's just you haven't been paid enough. You don't have enough commitment from the owner to do as much analysis as you plan to, assuming you have an engaged owner. But nonetheless, you believe that if you had these kind of analytics, right, and you had a project scenario set of data to share with the building owner, that our general experience is if you can get to that point, you're going to get a much more engaged conversation that frankly either leads to we get to a next step, or maybe we don't. We get on to the next one quickly, right? So it's a qualification tool. But in any case, we're generally going to see this at a level 1 plus 20, 25%. Level 2 would be more akin to what you're seeing here, right? Plus or minus 10%. And a level 3 would be, say, plus or minus 5%. And in a moment, I'm going to show you how we'll use that uncertainty or accuracy range to help answer the building owner question that frankly you know is coming at some point in the discussion, right, about the skepticism. Can I believe these projections? And your ability to respond to that and say, well, we've thought that through, and here's a buffer, right? And we'll create a so-called worst case analysis, right? And the worst case analysis would use, say, the upper end of the cost, right? So let's say you had a cost overrun in this case of 10%, and you had a savings underperformance of 10%. So you take that delta, right, off of your projections and say to the building owner, or frankly the capital provider, who again, they're trained to go right to worst case, right? And to say, this is a reasonable spread, right, around our projections, and if the wheels fall off, what actually happens? Does the project still perform? And frankly, it's of course the building owner's prerogative, it's the lender's prerogative to say, you know what, we want a bigger spread than that. Okay, great. You come in, you change one metric or two metrics, and you rerun it, right? So these are the tools that we have learned, and it might even be the case. I'd say certainly projects that have multi-ECMs involved, it's not uncommon for the contractor, ESCO consultant to prepare 2 or 3 project scenarios to go into that conversation with the owner, right? Anticipating that the building owner is going to have some what ifs, right? And the ability to right on the spot say, well, here's how, what we've anticipated a few of your what if questions. Here's how it changes the metrics on the way you would view this investment, right? And that'll become a little bit clearer in a moment when we get into the reporting. But that's a key metric. The other thing, Anthony referenced the price escalation factors. Of course, that is a critical component as well, right? So there's escalation factors for electric and fuels. Generally, I think, Anthony, you mentioned it this morning, right? We default to the 3%, which is consistent with the New England ISO numbers, and we're pretty firm on that, but you'll see these projections that just seamlessly goes into the projected numbers, right? What we don't want to see, of course, is you use 5 or 6% just because, right? And of course, you put 5 or 6%, all of a sudden the savings look fantastically wonderful, but is that a realistic assumption, right? So these are the things we have to guard against. Also, certainly the capital providers and Cephia is going to want to see an annual savings degradation factor included. Generally, we default to 1%. Again, put yourself in the shoes of the capital provider and the owner, right? If you're qualifying for a 20-year term loan, that's a long term, right? And it's only natural you're going to want to have some assumption about savings degradation of the equipment over that long term, and they're going to want to see that you've thought that through and you've baked that into your analysis. We generally default to this 1%, but I think it's fair to say the technical review team is open to listening if you want to challenge that on the basis of a certain technology or something. Again, just be prepared to have some supporting case study data, et cetera, if you want to. Generally, you'd want to put in a lower number. Again, good news about CPACE is it can support 100% financing, and that's generally what we see people doing, unless the one caveat there is unless the SIR doesn't work. Right? If you can't get the project to get over a 1.0 SIR, maybe it's the case, and we've seen a few of these, maybe it's the case that the owner has to come out of pocket for some amount of project cost, right, to make the SIR work, but it's still a home run relative to what their other options would be, right, either coming out of capital budget or getting a typical commercial loan. Interest rate, Genevieve will speak to this. The 20-year term carries a 6% interest rate, which was the case here. There'll be closing costs, which are covering underwriting fees, the fees for the underwriting team, including ourselves that are supporting you on this. Generally, you're going to see that, depending on project size, from 1 to 3%, and that will be factored into the analysis. And so everything is transparent as it relates to all these key financial assumptions going back to your building owner and the capital provider.
So I think those closing costs are included in the program.
Yes, those closing costs are and the interest rate differs based on term. That's in the program guideline as well. So just tick through those. Those are just the areas that I wanted to highlight. Any questions on the key assumptions? Yes, Mike.
Question is relative to utility incentives. CPACE, there is no penalty if you miss your goal. However, the utilities, if they have an extension dollar prescribed, did not meet it, they can withdraw the dollar.
So the question is about utility incentives that are performance-based.
Well, yeah. So let's just say it was a project that was $500 million with $250,000 incentives, and they only paid $200,000. The customer would then be on hook for $50,000.
Everyone hear that? So if it's a $250,000 assumed incentive at some sort of a performance base, let's say 12 months after installation, there's an M&V event, and lo and behold, they only qualify for $200K of the incentive instead of $250,000, right?
At the end of the inspection, so
Right.
6-month project, they would expect it, if
After installation and commissioning though?
Correct.
Okay, that risk in this model would be on the owner. So part of what we would assume, and maybe that's part of your worst case scenario, frankly, right? Maybe if that's the case where there's a performance incentive in play, maybe you even want to prepare a separate scenario report. And again, we'll see this in a minute, how this can be done quite efficiently, but maybe you even want to prepare an incentive report that says, here's what it's going to look like if you qualify for the full incentive. Here's what it would look like if you qualify for, if you miss your performance incentive. But that, just to be clear, if that's after installation, obviously the finance agreement would have to be all buttoned up, so everyone's going to have to kind of sign on for what do we think the best scenario is. So now we're moving from data going in with a certain number of key assumptions to kind of inform these calculations, now to beginning to make. We're still in the project scenario development process, but we're going to begin to take those datas, including that key assumption information that I just went through, and make a few calculations. Again, this is the pretty graph version, but I just wanted to express what we're doing here. This chart is not too different than what Anthony had referenced earlier in the morning, if you recall. This hard blue curve here is the actual baseline data. Again, so we're going to take the actual baseline development work that you've done, again, with the caveats that can be either whole building, all utility bill based. Maybe it's a solar project, it's just the KWH data, it's just the electric data, or maybe it's some modeled baseline, if you're working in a rehab building or something of that effect. But in any case, that's going to establish the actual baseline. So once your baseline data is uploaded into the system, that will be calculated automatically, as will this upper purple dotted line, which is the projected baseline data, creating the scenario that if the building owner took what we all know is the most popular option, which is do nothing. Right? So if I'm the building owner and I do nothing, how can I expect my building to perform in the future if I just ignore all your ECM recommendations? That curve is a weather normalized calculation, right, that says, and again, I know Anthony got into the regression analysis and so on and so forth. If you don't have the bent to understand that, the good news is you really don't have to. The system will make those calculations for you. Just have the comfort to know those calculations are made in accordance with the ASTM and ASHRAE methodology that Anthony reviewed this morning. And then what's going to happen is these yellow icons and the lower graph indicate the projected performance of the building, accounting for the ECMs that you have put into the system. Those yellow icons are showing where they do on the curve on the basis of your estimated completion dates. So one of the things that we're going to be looking for at the measure level is what is your estimated date of installation. And like any multi-ECM project, of course, they could be staged over some period of time, right? Not uncommon for you'll see some of these bigger projects around here, $2-3 million projects. That might be a 6-month, 9-month, 12-month process for that matter, right, on the installs. And they could be phased. So we'll begin to accrue the savings, on the basis of when you have estimated the installation date would be complete. And then as Anthony was describing this morning, the delta between that projected off the do nothing option and your savings projections will equate to your consumption savings, and that consumption savings will include a degradation factor, which again defaults at 1% annually. And on the cost side, if you go to the next slide, on the cost side will include price escalation factors. If you recall, our defaults are 3% electric and 3% fuel price escalation factors, right? And so that analysis will be turnkeyed by the system, those calculations. And then at that point, next slide, Will, you're then into this notion of, okay, now let me see how that all looks, right? So now you're at the stage of wanting to convert that technical analysis Again, back to our theme, one of our key themes today, right, of converting that into the language of finance, right? So a building owner can evaluate, a capital provider can evaluate this project consistent with the way they look at their typical investments. And I just wanted to show this because we'll drill in. Not uncommon to see this. So this is different scenarios for this project. One of the things, we'll look at this in a moment in the report, this particular project had a chiller proposed. As you all likely well know, and the chiller is whatever it is, a 40-year payback or something, right? So it doesn't look too wonderfully attractive, certainly as a standalone investment, but this particular project was, as Genevieve was describing this morning, it blended some short-term measures with some long-term measures. But that generally will draw the question now from the owner, and the owner will say, well, how would this project look with the chillers? How would it look without the chillers? How would it look, with all measures and so forth? Anyway, my point here is you have a tool where you can answer those what ifs in a pretty time efficient manner. And then ultimately, the sausage out of this process, which we're going to refer to in your book here in a moment, is some key financial metrics that generally a building owner or capital provider would be comfortable reviewing and analyzing. The upper section where that blue arrow is pointing is referring to the unleveraged scenario. And again, that's the case where the building owner will evaluate how will these investment returns look if I invested in this project and funded it completely out of capital budget, right? I didn't use any third-party financing. And we'll take a look at this. Generally, as you know, I know I'm speaking to the choir here because you're fighting this fight every day, but generally they're going to kind of look at that from a simple payback basis, right? And they do a pretty effective job beating down to whatever the number is, right? I have to have a 3-year payback or less. So this project, I know you bear with me, I know you can't read this well here, but it's a little over 8-year simple payback. So general experience, how many owners are doing double backflips for that? The answer is not a lot, right? Tough sell, right? So then you move into the PACE world, and here's where you come with the too good to be true theme, right? How about if we turn that into zero out of pocket and it produces cash flow positive immediately, right? You finance $2 million, includes some closing costs. The debt service over the 20-year term is about $3.5 million. You're saving over that finance term about $5 million with $1.6 million worth of total cash flow, right? And so the goal here is to elevate this conversation that typically happens today with commercial buildings, which is predominantly simple payback focused, because frankly, that's the world everybody has been living in, right? It's been a pretty tough environment the past, say, 5-6 years. And that's just, the way it is. The truly potential game-changing aspect of PACE is to turn that conversation on its head and say, well, actually, the best way to evaluate this kind of a project is on a projected cash flow basis. Will, if you'll go to the next slide. And that tees up this projected cash flow evaluation. Now generally speaking, now you're talking the language of the building owner. And you're certainly talking the language of the capital provider, right? Because the capital provider, simply put, is investing in these future cash flows, right? So the left-hand side shows what would the cash flows look like if I was the building owner and came out of pocket, in this case, with a $2 million check. And frankly, that looks pretty good. One small detail, not many have the $2 million check to write, right? So that's all well and good, but we just, we know what that's resulted in the marketplace the past 5 years, right? Not many big projects like that. On the right-hand side is the so-called PACE too good to be true offer, right? That's the zero out-of-pocket investment, and you can see on an average annual basis, I had that metric on the other slide, but it's about, I think it was $90,000 average annual positive cash flow over this 20-year term. That's not too shabby, right? I've heard the joke that, CPACE, it's the equivalent of telling your building owner you're going to install an ATM machine in the corner of their office and it's going to spit out $90,000 a year. And they get to accelerate these improvements improve the quality of the, or if you could back up one slide. Remember I was talking earlier about this is often a point of view of the existing mortgage holder. Remember I mentioned the two things with the existing mortgage holder. They're generally focused on repayment ability of my borrower impact and impact to my collateral, right? So in the collateral world, generally in the commercial real estate world, right, you're taking the net operating income of the building and you're applying a capitalization rate, which is a market-based rate, right? Kind of varies according to location and property type, but this 7.5% would be a general rule. So this particular project, which is a $2 million project, is projected to add $3.1 million to the asset's value, right? So what does that mean? As you have maybe encountered when you're prospecting commercial building owners, it wouldn't be uncommon to hear that objection of, well, I hear you on this too good to be true stuff, but I'm out of here in 5 years, right? Worst case, 7 years, right? So why would I make such an investment? Why would I make such an investment over a 20-year timetable if I plan to exit the building in, say, 5 years? And that, it's understandable why that question would be asked, because that's the way the world works today with commercial loans, as Anthony, I think, touched on several times this morning, right? The typical commercial loan would accelerate at the time of that transition of ownership, right? And that building, the current owner, the seller in this case, right, would have to essentially eat that cost, right? And that's a negative, right? And they say, well, why would I do that? Here, they enjoy the benefit of the, you have to presume they're going to get some greater sell price, right, in that, let's say, that 5-year exit. Where's the problem? And the PACE assessment, again, transfers to the new owner. So you just kind of keep layering on the one good benefit after another. Question?
On the previous slide, I noticed that the cash flow, around the 11th year, 11, 12, and around year 16, you have some big jumps there. Is that like end of life?
Yeah, if we could go back a few slides, that's a good question. Keep going back. Well, I want to go to the list of ECMs. Keep going. One more. Okay. You have a number of energy conservation measures. Again, I know it's going to be difficult to see, but you have pumps, for example, that have a 10-year life, drives, 10-year life, fans, 13-year life, VFDs, 10-year life, BMS, 10-year life. So again, that's a key observation and a key point I was trying to make earlier. In the financial analytics, we're going to assume those savings will persist over the term of that measure, and then they go away. Okay? So it's not uncommon when you see some of these projects. Again, this project would generally qualify for a 19, 20-year term on the basis of the weighted EULs, but it's not uncommon when you get out there in the out years, some of those savings are no longer. So you can either plan a sinking fund and have some replacement cost in there, which generally our contractors don't like to do, or just assume the savings only persist over the EUL.
Which made sense until like a year 13 where it jumps back up on your, if you go all the way back, sorry to come back before.
Yep.
On year 13 it jumps back up. So, what kind of event is going to cause cash flow to jump back up?
Between that year 12 at 94 and year 13 at 100? Yeah, I don't know that detail here, but we'd have to get into the projected savings and the intersection of those. But that's generally.
I think it drops down to a bunch of stuff ended in year 10, but you're still escalating your savings, right?
Yep.
So it looks like the escalation.
Yeah, you have that. Remember, you have this intersection of price escalation, savings degradation, and you're building up a savings projection using the EUL of each individual term. So you've got quite a few moving parts there, which again speaks to the power of the scenario engine, that you can make some of these changes. And frankly, let's say this project, let's take your point and run with it a little bit. Let's say that impact of, in other words, you had so many measures in a project like this that were, say, rated 10 years. It really destroyed the cash flow right on the back end. what an obvious second scenario may be, right, after viewing that, is go on and take some of those 10-year life ones that the owner views as not, direly critical, and take them out of the equation. Rerun the scenario and see how that improves the cash flows, right? And that sort of iterative analysis is really what this tool is designed to do. So these things that you're picking up very astutely, that's the way actually we would want you, studying this. And believe me, the building owner generally would not be bashful to pick those up either, right? And they're going to want to see those different what-if impacts. So the whole long and short of that process, right, is you're in that project scenario development. Ultimately, you're going to arrive with the building owner, generally in a collaborative conversation, to what you believe is the optimized project. The point I wanted to stress again is, generally you're going to have an owner who will have a knee-jerk instinct to think simple payback. Should expect it. Nothing wrong with that. That's completely understandable. The other thing that there will be a knee-jerk of is, as soon as they hear that you have financing in the sentence, the next question is going to be what? What's the rate? Right? I've been trained all my, when I get a loan, that's pretty what matters, right? What's the rate? So these are the kind of questions you should expect, right? You should expect a simple payback focus. And frankly, as an industry, that's the way we've been selling projects, because that's the only way we can get the yes, right? You have this game-changing opportunity with CPACE. We obviously want to leverage the power of PACE in this context, and we want them to understand as an owner, there's now cause to reassess the way you're evaluating these projects. And if we use our noggin well, we may be able to construct a so-called well-designed project that requires zero out-of-pocket cost and can generate immediate positive cash flow, right? But we've got to take the blinders of simple payback off, and we have to may have to take the blinders of what's the rate off, and look at the analysis, right? And that's really what we're seeking to do with these key financial metrics and cash flow analytics. And I would just say to you, this process has kind of been iteratively developed in a market-driven way here, say over the past 3 years. And we fully expect it will keep being developed on an iterative basis as folks like you, begin to interact with your building audience as well. But I wanted to convey you can have the confidence level that this is being successful in the market. Generally speaking, it's going to make sense to your building owners. It's going to make sense to capital providers. And it is certainly an aid in making these kinds of project sales. And ultimately, you can even think of, Kim was just mentioning, for example, not to get too nuanced here, but in the multifamily sector, right? You may be with a project that has such a complicated multifamily property ownership situation that the notion of them buying into CPACE existing mortgage holder consent might be a long road to hoe, right? So there can be other potential financing options that may be brought to the table. The existing mortgage holder, but I think we've had one or two of these, where the existing mortgage holder was approached for consent on the PACE assessment, and the existing mortgage holder said, wait a minute, why aren't I funding this project, right? And that's great. And they have every ability to do that. And in some respects, it's almost like a right of first refusal, right, for the existing lender, right? And frankly, I think over time you're going to see that develop, right, where lenders will come to recognize, wow, this PACE thing is a business development program for me, right? My existing customers are coming to me with a vehicle now to fund property improvements that, again, do the two good things that I'm concerned about, right? Improve my borrower's repayment ability and improve the value of my collateral. I do nothing. I take advantage of this PACE structure, and I can provide the funding, right? Safia is perfectly open to that, right? So that's an option in the financing space. Another option is, again, I think this number might be up to 14 or 15 so-called pre-qualified capital providers. Right from the get-go, a third-party capital provider can fund the project. Or one of the fantastic benefits we have here in the state as a result of the Cephia Green Bank structure is Cephia is willing to, in effect, do the construction period lending, right? Which spoke to the question here earlier today about, well, wait a minute, time out here. How's the cash flows all work around this, right? In other words, Cephia will step up as you go through this standardized process, right? Get to a finance agreement. Cephia will fund the project. As I think was mentioned earlier, we're on the cusp of a very exciting industry first event here in Connecticut where probably shouldn't give a timetable, but let's say sometime in March, is that fair to say? Sometime in March, Cephia will announce the first CPACE project portfolio sale to a third-party lender. I think Anthony was touching on this earlier. So what that means is Cephia has funded a number of these projects, right, and we'll bundle them together at some point. This first portfolio is something like $8 million worth of projects, 7.5. And that is a very welcome event. Frankly, those of you that have maybe been seeing some press around this whole third-party financing area over the past several years, it's an event that the industry has been gunning for now for a number of years, say 3 years. And this is the first time that it's going to come to fruition. And we think that will bring added visibility, obviously, and focus of both national, local, and regional capital providers to kind of be made more aware of, wow, this is a real opportunity here. And wow, Cephia has actually created a model that can really scale, right? To those of you that have been involved in this, and not that it's certainly all figured out at this juncture, but as you're probably getting a sense of here today, this process is getting more and more streamlined as we go. The transaction costs are coming down, right? In a way that you can see this kind of business model can be supported, on a nationwide basis. And that's important for us as an industry because then the capital providers will have the confidence to come in full force and really fund these projects in a very big scale way once they have the confidence that this underwriting process meets their rigor. And frankly, this is a little different animal from the point of view of the capital provider, right? Because this is really truly energy savings-based underwriting, right? As opposed to what the bank currently does, which is credit-based underwriting, right? So a little different animal, and they have to get comfortable around those projected savings. Comment about the M&V, and then we'll move ahead. On the M&V, again, there's a specific module to track after the project has been installed, what the actual performance is versus the projections, which is where we left off and everybody kind of signed on for at the point of the financing agreement, right? And that projections will calculate the actual versus projected on both the consumption and cost side. We have some standardized reporting and modules that will support those workflows. And that's just a graph of how that looks. Essentially, we're going to pick up on that graph that you created in the project scenario mode, and over the M&V reporting period, this furthest magenta line, of course, you want that line to be furthest south on the graph, right? Which indicates, wow, I actually bested those projections. But in any case, there's a module I just wanted to share with you that is available depending on what we agree to with the building owner, right? What the term of the M&V engagement will be, what the frequency of the reporting will be. With those caveats set, we have a module to help report out that to them, the building owner and the capital provider that will have an interest to know how we're doing. So with that said, question? NRA is a so-called non-routine adjustment. So let's say, I think one of the things Anthony was theming this morning was this notion of a major renovation, right? So let's say you're 2 years into your PACE financing term, and actually, good news event for the building owner, things are going gangbuster, they build a new wing to their building, right? That's cause for a recalculation of the baseline, right? Because the numbers have changed substantially, right? And it's a kind of fair to all parties. In other words, you may have to reset the baseline table And generally, that's something that comes about with those major changes. I think this gentleman asked the question about the data center client, right? Even something like that. Let's say I've got a 50,000 square foot building and my primary tenant, let's say, is 30 of the 50,000 square feet. Out goes a less energy use intensity type tenant, and in comes a data center type who takes the 30,000 square foot, and their energy use profile is, they're 3x the guy that just left, right? That may be cause to sit down and recalculate a baseline, right? So that is just to say those sort of things. Frankly, we support the performance contracting world with this tool, and that's not uncommon to see, and we have the provisions to be able to handle that. Okay, so I wanted to do, in a few more minutes here, I just wanted to orient you to a couple things. In your binder, if you go to right behind the agenda, maybe about 4 pages in, sorry these pages aren't sequentially numbered, but you will see a guy that looks something like this here, right? And there's 3 of these. This first one is labeled under the scenario name. Up top it's called Office Sample Full Assessment. So in other words, this is a comprehensive whole building project. And it's labeled under its scenario name on page 1, 85% commercial loan, 6 years at 5%. So this is that scenario we referenced a moment ago, right? That wouldn't be uncommon for your building owner to say, oh, what's the rate? Your rate's 6%. The guy down the street who I usually deal with says his rate is 5%. I guess I'm better going down the street, right? And again, you should anticipate that question. So what does that really mean? I wanted to just create this scenario to help us work through this. So again, page 1, the top section, the unleveraged scenario. Again, that's the case that they're going to evaluate as if they would fund it out of capital budget. Second section on page 1, the leverage scenario. And the other thing that's, this is probably a pretty favorable commercial loan set of assumptions, by the way. Might not be too easy to just have the 15% down payment, right, or 85% financed. And they may not get a rate as low as 5% or a term this long for that matter. But in any case, you can see the numbers here, right? This is a $2 million project, right? So at 85% financed, I would be required to put $300,000 down, and therefore, under the amount financed, finance $1.7 million, right? The debt service over that 6-year financing term would therefore be about $2 million. And my savings over that 6-year finance term would be 1.6, right? So therefore you have negative cash flows over the 6-year term of $670,000. In other words, your savings to investment ratio at 0.8, let's go back to Anthony's definition of this morning of commercially attractive. Let's just say this probably wouldn't meet the definition of commercially attractive, right? And if you look at the second page, you see the cash flows, and again you see a healthy negative cash flow of 670 in the projected scenario, going to over $1 million in the worst case. And so in short, even though the knee-jerk would be, wow, the guy down the street has a 5% deal for me, CPACE is 6%, I guess I know what I need to know. Not really, again, if you're looking at it from a cash flow basis. So now let's take a look at the next scenario, which is this same project, only this time using the CPACE vehicle, which again is 100% financing. You'll see under this scenario name 100% CPACE financing, 20 years at 6%. So it's a point higher interest rate. And this will give you a sense of, wow, the power of the long-term financing, frankly, is as we were all trained earlier in our school days. It truly is remarkable. So take a look at the leverage scenario section on page 1 now. So this meets the so-called too good to be true, right? 0 out of pocket. So we're financing 100%. We finance $2 million. We've got an estimated debt service over that 20-year term of $3.4 million. We've got an estimated savings over the 20-year term of of 6 million, and therefore 1.6 million of excess cash flows over that term. And you can look at some of those other metrics, and the key point is the time to positive cash flow is immediate. You look at the second page, and I think this is the same example I used on the slide that we were just looking at, right? So it becomes a pretty compelling contrast on what we've loosely referred to here today as the power of pace, right? So we can dig into these further as you get more familiar. For those of you who are solar contractors only, I have a third scenario report in here, which is a relatively small $153,000 solar only project. And you can take maybe for this one we'll start on page 4, because I think this one has the rec question that I wanted to. Does it? Yes, it does. Okay. So on page 4, which is the list of energy conservation measures, you see this is a single measure project. It's a 55 kW roof mount PV system. It's about a $150,000 project. We generally, by the way, on the solar PV projects, typically what we see the contractor doing is buying the extended warranty on the inverters. So I think the standard inverter is rated at a 10-year useful life. So again, from a capital provider and owner point of view, to get confidence in these metrics, right, they're going to want to have confidence that the equipment is going to last the 20-year term of the loan. So you'll see that extended warranty is built in, and then you'll see down below the term of the rec, right? And also, this project did not include it, but the investment, those of you in the solar space that are familiar with using the investment tax credit, which I think came up a little bit earlier this morning as well, you can include the investment tax credit in your project analysis, which again would have the effect of buying down the project value. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I sort of brought that up this morning. My question about that is, if the customer is going to just buy the equipment themselves, right, capital expenditure, they get the full benefit of the tax credit here, tax equity, right? That full 30% of the small cost. If they go to some third-party funding, sometimes the bank wants to monetize some of that investment tax credit, and so now maybe like 70-75% of the benefit is passed to the customer, the bank's keeping some of that. How is that dealt with?
Question is like a typical power purchase agreement, right, where you may have a third party who wants to take some of that tax credit dollars. That's really, well, it could be in play if that's the way that an owner wanted to structure a deal, but frankly in the traditional PACE financing, especially when Cephia is doing that initial construction period lending, there's no agenda there of Cephia to take any portion of that tax credit, right? So it's all in play for the owner, with the caveat, of course, the owner has to be in position to be able to take the tax credit, right? Right, or nonprofits may be more inclined, right? As Will's pointing out, nonprofits may be more inclined to use the PPA because they can't take advantage of the tax credit. I think I'm about at my time, so maybe one last question.
So for the SIR, for the worst case scenario, is that what SIR has to be above 1?
No, the SIR requirement is in the projected case, okay? Now, that's the statutory requirement, right? That the savings to investment ratio must be greater than 1 as projected, right? Having said that, a building owner may say, okay, well, what is my view of a worst case scenario here? And they may push back on you as a project developer and say, I expect the worst case, so how about if we talk about that, right? How does it look in a best case? But in terms of qualifying for financing, it's going to be based on the projected case. But the reason I wanted to get you comfortable with that worst case analysis, again, you're using the upper range of the cost overrun and the lower range of savings underperformance. And again, you can toggle those uncertainty levels to be whatever you want, right? But it's a mechanism to have a building owner conversation and bring them through that in a way that they'll have confidence, right? And then you bolster that confidence by saying it's going to be third-party reviewed, and Tom's going to come up now and kind of speak to that process in a little bit more detail. So with that, I'll wrap. Those of you that have projects in mind, I would encourage you to get on the bandwagon, get with Will, get your initial applications in. At such point in time when the initial application is approved by the Cephia team, you'll get a handoff from Will or Genevieve to the SRS team, and we'll begin to collaborate on this process, right, to produce these project scenario reports, and that's where we'll be available for your support. Very good, thanks.